This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did.
Prison is a hard place to find yourself in. It's one thing if you did something wrong to get there. It's another thing altogether if you're there as a victim versus an actual criminal, particularly if your conviction was sponsored by the members of your own family. Well, this is precisely the place that a young man named Joseph found himself in. We're introduced to him at the age of 17. He is the son of Jacob, the grandson of Isaac, and the great-grandson of Abraham. He's a part of this great nation that God in the upper story is slowly building to reveal his presence, his power, and his plan to get all people back. But this family didn't function as one who was going to bring us back into a relationship with God. They could barely get along with each other. Studies show us that firearms in the home are almost always either intentionally or accidentally used on family members versus perpetrators. The same is true for the weaponry of poor character. The handgun of lies and the shotgun of deception were used almost exclusively on every member of Joseph's family, particularly young Joseph. You see, of the 12 brothers, Joseph was Dad's favorite. He even sported a coat of many colors that his dad gave him and left his brothers feeling cold-hearted towards him. And to make matters worse, Joseph had several dreams that he believed came from God, where at the end of the dream, all of his brothers were bowing down to him. In his innocence, he shared those dreams with his brothers. His brothers, in turn, declared their little brother their worst nightmare. One day, Daddy Jacob sent Joseph out in the field to fetch his brothers who were tending to the sheep. They roughed up Joseph and then threw him into a pit. And over lunch, they made the decision to sell their younger brother to a band of gypsies on their way to Egypt. Joseph must have been frightened out of his mind. Once in Egypt, he's sold as a slave to serve in the house of Potiphar, the captain of the guard for the mighty Pharaoh. Then there's this surprising sentence that just appears in the story. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. Even though God allowed his brothers to abuse him, God is now prospering him. With God's help, Joseph quickly rises and is put in charge of Potiphar's entire house. But then another twist. Another bomb drops. We are told that Joseph was well-built and handsome, and that Potiphar's wife made repeated advancements on Joseph, but he does the right thing and he refuses her. Well, one day she tells her husband that Joseph made an advance on her and she resisted. And Joseph's put in prison. Up and down like a seesaw, but the next thing we know, he's back up again. While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. God again allowed for an unjust attack on Joseph and allowed him to go to prison. Yet once in prison, Joseph immediately gains favor and is put in charge of the prison. And one of the things that God did for Joseph was to give him the ability to interpret dreams. The story tells us that he's in prison for about 2 years when he gets a call from Pharaoh, the main dude, to come and interpret this dream he keeps having. Well, Joseph interprets the dream. Basically, he tells Pharaoh there's going to be 7 years of a bumper crop, or lots of food, and then there will be 7 years of famine, no food at all. You know, it's really helpful to know this. Genesis 41:46 tells us that Pharaoh believes him and puts him second in command over all of Egypt to lead. He's now 30 years old. 7 years of harvest come, and Joseph stores up food to get them through the 7 years of famine. No other nation or people group knows what's coming. At the end of the first 7 years, the 7 years of famine begins, but under Joseph's leadership, they are prepared. Now, the famine is affecting everyone, everywhere, including his father and his brothers back in Canaan. Jacob, Joe's dad, sends his sons to Egypt to get some food so they don't die. When they arrive in Egypt, they bow down before the second in command of all of Egypt, their punk brother Joseph, even though they didn't recognize him. Joseph is now 39 years old. 22 years has passed since he was sold down the river, thrown under the bus by his brothers. 22 years passed before the dream he dreamed as a teenage boy came true. After several emotional encounters, Joseph finally reveals his identity to his brothers. Here's what Joseph had to say to them in the story. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." What Joseph's brothers did to him in the lower story was completely wrong and had lifelong consequences of pain and guilt and depression. As a matter of fact, they could never really ever forgive themselves. But God used their sin-filled jealousy to accomplish his overall purpose, his upper story plan, which requires Israel to survive the famine. You see, somewhere in this journey, Joseph captured this, and very few people ever do. This is what enabled Joseph to process all the junk of his brothers and forgive them. Joseph was able to forgive his brothers for what they did to him in the lower story because he captured God's upper story plan. And that's huge. Some of you might think, wouldn't it have been easier for God to use his influence to recommend Joseph for the job instead of making him go through 22 years of struggle? Well, those 22 years of up and down struggles molded Joseph into the kind of man who could do what he did with integrity. Those 22 years gave Joseph an opportunity to see God's hand in life's most hopeless circumstances and situations and to learn to trust in God completely. Joseph, out of his position of power, moves his entire family to Egypt and gives them the fertile land of Goshen. The story tells us that when his dad was getting close to Egypt, Joseph went out in his chariot to meet him. Here's what the story says. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Joseph went on to be 110 years old. Yes, he had 22 tough years, but he ended up with 71 really great ones. And how rich it must have been to know that he was used by God to save Israel and to move God's upper story plan further toward completion. You know, the story is likely being rewritten for your life. Romans 8:28 tells us, and we know that all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. This promise of God tells us that if we love God and align our lives to his upper story purposes, everything in our lives the ups and the downs, the mountaintops and the valleys, the highs and the hurts, the raises and the rejections, the good and the bad are all working together to accomplish good. So be patient. Trust God. Let Him mold you during the difficult seasons to equip you for the assignment ahead. You may be in a prison cell right now, either real or figuratively speaking, but if you align your life to God, your story isn't finished yet.